Many of you have tried to read Marx, you can appreciate just how rapid his progress must have been after his literacy training. There's an anecdote about him reading Marx, and he didn't. I guess he didn't know who Marx was per se, but he was reading something written by him, and he said to one of his political comrades, "You know, we need to bring this old guy here to give a speech. Has really good ideas." So it may have been a jest. Maybe he didn't know who he was, but I don't know if he read Mao. I know that the urban-based FAPLA founders were very influenced by China. So I'm sure that many of them did read Mao. As for him, though, I really don't know. And so many of these people, this is another big problem of doing oral history. So many of these people are dead. The vast majority of the key organizers here are dead. They're killed in the 70s or the 80s, or they've died since. So relying on a relatively select, small group of people.
Well, my question is, apart from oral interviews, are there any archives that exist or survive?
Well, the images that I showed from the political propaganda, there's a great archive that collects a lot of surviving political pamphlets and so on. That's where I've taken all of that. So the Universidad Centroamericana in San Salvador has an archive that houses a lot of those materials from the Bloque, from the FAPLA, from various other groups here. So a lot of that literature is available, and it's very rich. In terms of other archives, there are a few small ones that I've come across. Lowell might have some ideas too, but there's a museum archive, the Museum of the Word and Image in San Salvador, which has some good stuff, but it's mostly in the 1980s and afterward. So that it's finding good archival materials has been a challenge. I'll just say that.
My question has to do with something related to my own sensibilities and research. It is a question about the educational level of the peasants that you interview, because if I understood you correctly, you are saying that the peasants were establishing the rules and calling the shots, and the people from the city had to adapt to the peasant culture. So you can say something about the educational level. If they were illiterate, we can talk about a culture that is already ingrained in the countryside, a set of values that is basically part of the culture that inform the identity that they have. They basically act on that culture. And the second question is, you have interviewed with the peasant catechists, but did you interview people from the city just to see the other side about how they felt in the interaction with peasants?
Yeah, so the question about peasants' education levels, very few of them would have had any more than primary school education. However, a few of them also had secondary education. Some peasant activists actually joined the high school students organization. So maybe I'm generalizing a bit too much when I say it was just primary level education. There were some students, especially from small rural towns, like the town I mentioned once, Arcatao in eastern Chalatenango, was a town of, I think, about 10,000 people. So it was still in its heyday. It was very much rooted in the countryside, but it surrounded by farms. But there was a little bit more of an urban feel. There was more education available in that town, and a number of these key organizers come from that town. So some of them did have high school education. Many were also literate. Apolinario was illiterate when he came to the organization. So I guess it's hard to generalize, but one point that I forgot to mention was just how young most of these peasants were. Most of the key peasant organizers were between the ages of 16 and 22, according to some of my informants. The second question, did I interview urban activists as well? Yeah, so a number of the people, some of the people I cited, like this guy Julio, was an urban Catholic youth activist. I interviewed, let's see, I think 3 or 4 people from Andes, which was nationwide. It wasn't just urban, but the teachers themselves tended to come from the cities because they had gone to, they'd gone through teacher training courses and then they were stationed at different points in the country. So I've tried to get a balance of urban and rural interview subjects.
Just to say something that what you are saying here in the relationship between peasants and urban organizers runs counter to something that some of us know firsthand because we live through that period. And we are completely aware of the influence of the Cuban Revolution and the importance from the Cuban perspective of having a political vanguard, a revolutionary communist party, providing ideological guidance. And that happened, that was basically the fundamental message that it was important to have the scientific knowledge that only Marxism was able to provide. And according to Lenin, the Lenin manifesto, what was to be done, the working class or the peasants, for that matter, they are unable to reach to that level of scientific knowledge. So the revolutionary, the professional revolutionaries, they had the moral obligation, the political obligation of bringing that knowledge to the masses. And the information that you are presenting runs counter to that narrative. That's very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was an ongoing tension within the FAPL, and that's one of the reasons I think it's so interesting, that there certainly was a strong vanguardism, but it was, in practice, it was tempered, it was modified, it was rethought, rehashed, and, they certainly did believe that peasants had the capability of becoming revolutionary leaders. Apolinario was actually brought onto the Central Committee. So, there was that tension, but there were also, there was that vanguardist self-conception, but there were also mitigating elements there. And in regard to Cuba, the FAPL actually had a strong critique of Folkismo in the 70s from its foundation. They were Folkismo, the Folco is the idea that a small group of guerrillas can instigate a revolution. And it's 12 men in Cuba, eastern Cuba, provoking a revolution. That kind of idea. The FAPL reacts against that and stresses much more strongly the need for mass organizing. So from the start, they have a big emphasis on organizing the masses.